Hi, it's Mrs. Powell. We're going to read Chapter 8 from Mr. Popper's Penguins. Chapter 8, Penguins Promenade. And this is from Mr. Popper's Penguins by Richard and Florence Atwater. Mr. Popper soon found that it was not so easy to take a penguin outside for a walk. Captain Cook did not care at first for the idea of being put on a leash. However, Mr. Popper was firm. He tied one end of the clothesline to the penguin's fat throat and the other to his own wrist. "Ork!" said Captain Cook indignantly. Still, he was a very reasonable sort of bird, and when he saw that protesting did him no good, he recovered and he decided to let Mr. Popper lead him. Mr. Popper put on his best Sunday hat and opened the front door with Captain Cook waddling graciously next to him. "Gaw!" said the penguin, stepping at the edge of the porch and down the steps. Mr. Popper gave him plenty of line on the leash. "Look!" said Captain Cook, raising his flippers as he leaned bravely and slid down the steps on his stomach. Mr. Popper followed, although he walked, he didn't slide. Captain Cook quietly got up on his feet again and strutted to the street ahead of Mr. Popper, with many a quick turns of his head and pleased comments on the new scene. Down Proudfoot Avenue came a neighbor of the Poppers, Mrs. Callahan, with her arms full of groceries. She stared in astonishment when she saw Captain Cook and Mr. Popper, looking like a big penguin himself. "Heavens to Betsy!" she exclaimed as the bird began to investigate all the things under her dress. "It isn't an owl. It isn't a goose. It's it's an Antarctic penguin." "Get away from me," said Mrs. Callahan to Captain Cook. "Get away. Is it an anteater?" "No," said Mr. Popper. "I just told you it's an Antarctic penguin. He was sent to me from the South Pole." "Well, take your South Pole goose away from me at once," said Mrs. Callahan. Mr. Popper was very obedient, and he took Captain Cook and he started to pull him away. He figured it was easier than arguing with Mrs. Callahan and trying to point out to her that he was a penguin, not some kind of a goose. There you can see Mr. Popper all dressed up, kind of like a penguin. There's Captain Cook, and I guess that's Mrs. Callahan. Suddenly, a car wheeled to the nearby curb with a shriek of brakes, and two young men jumped out, one of them with a camera. "This must be it," said the first young man to the other. "Oh, it's them, all right," said the second young man. The cameraman set up his tripod on the sidewalk. By this time, a small crowd had gathered around, and two men in white coats had come out of the drugstore to watch. Captain Cook, however, was too interested in looking in the window to bother to turn around. "You're Mr. Popper of 432 Proudfoot Avenue, aren't you?" asked the second young man, pulling a notebook out of his pocket. "Yes," said Mr. Popper, realizing that his picture was about to be taken for the newspaper. The two young men had, as a matter of fact, heard about the strange bird from the policeman, and had been on their way to the Popper house to get an interview when they saw Captain Cook walking on the leash. "Hey, Pelican, turn around and see the pretty birdie," said the photographer. "That's no pelican," said the other man, who was the reporter. "Pelicans have a big pouch in their beak." "Well, I think it was a dodo bird, except they're extinct. This will make a great picture, though, if I ever get it to turn around." Mr. Popper sighed. "It's a penguin," he said proudly. "Its name is Captain Cook." "Look," said the penguin, turning around now that they were talking to him, or about him. Spying the camera tripod, he walked over and examined it. "He probably thinks it's a three-legged stork," said the photographer. This bird of yours," said the reporter. "Is it a he or a she? The public will want to know." "Well, I call it Captain Cook," said Mr. Popper. "That makes it a he," said the reporter, writing it in his notebook. Still curious, Captain Cook started walking around and round and round, until the clothesline had wrapped all the way around Mr. Popper, and all the way around the tripod, and all the way around Captain Cook. At the advice of one of the people watching, the tangle was finally straightened out by Mr. Popper walking back around the tripod in the opposite direction. At last, Captain Cook, standing next to Mr. Popper, posed for the picture. Mr. Popper straightened his tie, and the cameraman snapped a good picture. Captain Cook shut his eyes, and this is the way the picture finally appeared in the newspaper. "One last question," asked the reporter. "Where did you get your strange pet?" "Oh, from Admiral Drake. He works as an explorer in the South Pole. He sent him to me for a present." "Yeah," said the reporter, as though he didn't really believe Mr. Popper. "Well, it's still a good story." The two young men jumped in their car. Mr. Popper and Captain Cook continued their walk with quite a crowd following and asking questions. The crowd was getting so thick that in order to escape, Mr. Popper led Captain Cook into a barber shop. The man who had the barber shop up to this time had been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. And that's it for Chapter 8. When we come back next time, we will read Chapter 9. Bye.